More news out of that criminal trial of Vice President Cheney's confidant and former Chief of Staff Scooter Libby. Hardball's David Schuster was at the courthouse all day. David, I guess our show was mentioned there today.
Chris, absolutely, and we'll backtrack and talk about, of course, the big picture, of course, here is when did the Vice President's confidant, Scooter Libby, learn that Valerie Wilson, the wife of administration critic, worked at the CIA? How did he learn about it? And did Libby then lie and perjure himself when he said he learned about it from reporters? What prosecutors are doing is they're putting witness after witness on the stand showing that Scooter Libby was told Valerie Wilson worked at the CIA before Scooter Libby had conversations with reporters. Today, the blockbuster testimony came from Kathy Martin, Vice President Cheney's own press secretary during the relevant time period. She described in dramatic fashion the very first press report that came out in May, a column by the New York Times that made an oblique reference to an ambassador going to Niger and concluding that, in fact, Iraq had not been seeking uranium from Africa. Martin testified that the Vice President's office wanted more information on this trip, and she testified in dramatic fashion about talking to Bill Harlow, the spokesman of the CIA, and asking him about this trip, and Harlow telling her Ambassador Joe Wilson, who used to be ambassador in the Middle East, he was the ambassador who went on this trip, and here's what he concluded, and oh, by the way, his wife, Valerie Wilson, works at the CIA. Martin testified on the stand. She immediately went to the office of the Vice President and told Vice President Cheney and Scooter Libby, this is what we know. The CIA says that Ambassador Joseph Wilson was the ambassador on his trip and his wife works at the CIA. Martin then describes the period in July of 2003 when Ambassador Wilson himself goes public. He writes a column in the New York Times. He goes on NBC's Meet the Press. And Martin says at that point, the Vice President's office was focused even more. They were tracking media strategy. They were tracking which reporters were writing about this. They were also tracking Hardball with Chris Matthews. Martin said she was directed by the Vice President to pay particular attention to Hardball because Chris, you were the one who was focusing so heavily on the questions about what did this mean? How did this claim get in the State of the Union about Niger? Did the Vice President get told about it? Did the Vice President know, in fact, Wilson's conclusion before that got into the State of the Union? Martin said that the Vice President's office was so focused on this and so obsessed with the reporting on Hardball that she, in fact, had her staff essentially make clips of Hardball and transcripts and would deliver those transcripts to the Vice President and to Scooter Libby. In the midst of all of this, the Vice President himself was writing out talking points for Ari Fleischer, the White House press secretary, who was then getting bombarded with questions in the White House press briefings about Joe Wilson's column and what he found in Africa. In addition, Martin then testified about a second conversation with Scooter Libby that involved Vice President Cheney. This was a conversation a little bit later in July with Matt Cooper. Matt Cooper was also working on a story for Time magazine about the Wilsons. And Kathy Martin testified they were trying to figure out how to respond. She talked about talking with Scooter Libby on Air Force Two on return from a trip. Scooter Libby going and talking to Vice President Cheney. Scooter Libby coming to the back of the plane with a card describing how Scooter Libby should deal with Matt Cooper and that Scooter Libby himself should be the one talking to the press. There was also testimony about another episode where the Vice President decided that Scooter Libby himself, the Vice President's right-hand man, should be dealing directly with the press, not Kathy Martin, when Andrea Mitchell was working on a story and when David Martin of CBS was working on a story. Chris, there were also developments regarding Stephen Hadley. At one point, Stephen Hadley, seeing this play out, saw a story criticizing the CIA and at a staff meeting with Scooter Libby and Kathy Martin present, glared and said, we should not be blaming anybody right now for the 16 words. That article was prompted by a conversation that Scooter Libby had, but Kathy Martin in this meeting was made to take the fall for Scooter Libby, and Scooter Libby never piped up and said, that was my responsibility. In addition, Chris, there were also some notes that were introduced as evidence dealing with the Vice President and the Office of the Vice President's strategy in all of this. And Kathy Martin's own notes, in her own handwriting, said leak. It was a dramatic day of testimony on defense cross-examination. The defense was trying to show that the Office of the Vice President had reason to be angry at the press reporting at the time. They're also trying to show that there may have been internal battles with the CIA, and that they're also trying to show that perhaps part of Martin's own recollections about what transpired during this crucial period might be suspect or might have some problems. Chris?
Of course, it all goes back to the question raised by Ambassador Joe Wilson, who came back from a trip to Niger, apparently with that information that there was no deal, apparently, between Saddam Hussein and that African government to buy uranium products, uranium elements. And, of course, the question is, why would a trip that was triggered by an inquiry by the Vice President not yield back that information to the Vice President that there was no deal? And why wouldn't that fact get into the State of the Union rather than the President's claim of British intelligence that said there was a deal to buy uranium, which, of course, became one of the underpinnings of this administration's argument that we had to go to war with Iraq because they were threatening us with a nuclear weapon.